Can you see and hear us?
Yes, but only faintly.
Is that any better, sir?
It is to a degree, but it's still a bit faint. Anyway, I can hear you.
Would you like us to see if we can improve the sound?
No, the trouble is it may interfere with your questioning if you're worrying about whether I can hear you or not, that's all. Let's start, see how we get on, and if I'm struggling, I'll let you know.
Thank you, sir. Our first witness today is Lorna Gratton.
It's fine now, by the way. You suddenly came through much more clearly.
Please could the witness be sworn?
I do solemnly,
Sincerely and truly,
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Please give your full name.
Lorna Rachel Gratton.
You should have in front of you a copy of a witness statement dated the 13th of September of this year. Do you have that before you?
I do, yes.
That statement runs to 103 pages. Could I ask you please to turn to page 99?
Yep,
Do you see your signature there at the end of your statement?
I do, yes.
Is the content of the statement true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes.
Thank you, Ms Gratton. As you know, my name is Ms Hodge and I ask questions on behalf of the inquiry. I shall begin by asking you some brief questions about your career background, if I may. Upon graduating from university in 2005, you began a career in teaching, is that correct?
Yes, I did the Teach First programme. Yeah.
You later joined the civil service in January 2010 and were assigned to work in the Treasury, is that right?
Yes.
In your statement, you say you worked in the Enterprise and Growth Unit and as Private Secretary to the Chancellor. Did you perform both of those roles simultaneously?
No, I was in the Enterprise and Growth Unit first, then I worked for the Chancellor, then I went back to the Enterprise and Growth Unit.
Thank you. You left the civil service in January 2014 to join Boston Consulting Group, later returning in July 2016 to serve as Private Secretary to the Prime Minister, is that correct?
Yes.
You subsequently worked in the Department for Culture, Media and Sport, where you were appointed the Director for the Digital and Tech Policy Directorate in May 2020, is that
Yes.
right? In October 2021, you joined UKGI as a Director and were appointed as the shareholder representative, non-executive director to the board of Sheffield Forge Masters, is that correct?
Yes.
Since May 2023, you've served as the UKGI Director with responsibility for the Post Office, is that right?
Yes, it is.
And have sat on the board of the Post Office as the shareholder representative,
Yes.
non-executive director. You have, in your role as UKGI Director, you currently have responsibility for leadership of the shareholder team, is that right?
Yes.
In your statement, you describe the responsibilities of that team as being to oversee the Post Office's corporate governance and strategy, and to monitor its stewardship of financial resources, is that correct?
Yes, it is.
I'd like to begin, please, by asking you some questions about the relationship between the government and the Post Office. In your statement, you describe the Memorandum of Understanding that exists between UKGI and what is now the Department of Business and Trade, and you explained that the MOU, which was signed in December 2019, draws a distinction between what we know as the policy function and the shareholder function as it applies to arm's length bodies such as the Post Office. Is that correct?
It is, yes.
You point out that the MOU formally assigns the policy function to the department and not to UKGI. Is that right?
That is, yes.
Although matters of policy are decided by the department, you acknowledge that they are communicated to UKGI, which is obliged to take them into account when performing its shareholder representative function. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely. So the department sets the objectives for Post Office, and UKGI helps ensure that the Post Office is delivering on those objectives.
How would you characterise the department's current policy objectives for the Post Office?
So the policy framework for Post Office as it stands is expressed in terms of the number of branches that the post office has to have, and the coverage of the UK population that have to be within a certain distance of a number of branches, and then the services that post office is subsidised by the government to provide, which are currently mails, banking and payment services, and then some other government services as well.
Does it remain the department's ambition that the post office should strive to achieve financial self-sufficiency?
Yes, as set out in the letter, the chair's letter. So the department writes an annual letter to the board of the post office, and financial sustainability, I think is the phrase used in the letter, is set out in that. Sustainability is slightly different from self-sufficiency.
What do you understand financial sustainability to be?
It's a really good question and a topic that is of live discussion within government. Post office is currently loss-making and has been since it was separated from Royal Mail. The losses are at the moment worsening. So I think as a starting position, we would like to stabilise the financial position of the company, and then take a view from there. But ministers have not yet given a steer on that.
So financial sustainability reflecting not an expectation of self-sufficiency, at least in the short term?
Not necessarily, no.
Do you consider that financial self-sufficiency is would that be a realistic objective for the post office, given the social function which it is required to perform by the department?
So I think you can separate out the two parts. You could have a financially self-sufficient commercial network, and then there are uneconomic branches which the government subsidises through the network subsidy. You could take one view that would be a sort of mode of self-sufficiency where the post office is funding the bits that are commercial and government is paying for the service delivered in the other bits of the branches. A sort of slightly more rigorous view of it would be that the post office would need to be cash generative on an overall basis. At the moment, that is not the case. It is, as I say, a live discussion with government at the moment between post office and the government as to whether or not that is achievable through changes to the post office.
And by changes to the post office, do you mean changes to the size of the post office network?
Not necessarily to the size of the network, largely due to changes to the post office's head office cost base.
You describe in your statement the various levers which are available to the government to influence the governance and management of the post office. Some of these are coercive powers, such as the power to dismiss the chair of the post office board. Is that correct?
Indeed.
Others you characterise as soft powers or influence over the direction of the company, such as maybe exercised through meetings between ministers and the senior leaders of the post office. Is that correct?
Yes.
In your statement, you suggest it's always been open to ministers to exercise power and influence over the post office, and you cite the example of Baroness Neville Rolfe writing to the incoming chair in September 2015, requesting that he prioritise getting to the bottom of concerns about Horizon. Is that right?
Yes, that is, yeah.
If all the necessary levers were available to ministers to influence post office management, what do you think went wrong from a governance perspective in relation to Horizon?
I wasn't involved at the time, so my reflections are based purely on sort of evidence that's been given to this inquiry. My understanding is that there was a lack of transparency from the post office to the government and within the post office to the board, so that there wasn't a widely shared understanding of what had gone wrong, and where people did know that information was not adequately shared with ministers, or indeed in some cases my understanding is with the board.
You say in your statement that a certain amount of caution needs to be shown regarding the exercise of those powers, hard and soft, by ministers. Is that right?
Yes, it is.
Why is that?
Post Office, as other arm's length bodies, has a board that has fiduciary responsibilities to the company. We try, as government, to attract sort of qualified individuals to be on that board, and they are typically people who've got a range of experiences and a range of backgrounds. The board, I think, needs to feel empowered to exercise oversight and exercise its responsibilities in holding the company to account. I think if there's too much interference from government, then the board doesn't feel empowered to do that. And I think we would find it difficult to retain people who've got that right skill set to join that board. You know, it's a significant time commitment to people. That said, I think there is a lot of space for ministers, as the shareholder of Post Office, to provide their views to the board. And I think, as with any 100% single shareholder owned company, the board should be willing to take a steer, because the success of the company should be closely aligned with what the shareholder considers to be success.
We'll return to that particular point shortly, but in your statement you say, as a matter of principle, the shareholder should not involve itself in the operational running of the business. That's a matter which should be left to the Post Office's board, and you've explained the concern about the board not feeling empowered. Do you consider that the distinction between the government's policy objectives for the Post Office and operational matters is one which is capable of being maintained in practice?
Yes, I think it is capable of being maintained in practice, although I think circumstances sometimes require more intervention from the shareholder's point of view and sometimes less intervention. And I think that it is appropriate for the shareholder to provide views where they feel very strongly on a matter of great significance. So, for example, on culture, I personally think that is a topic that is rightly for the shareholder, because it is integral to the running of the company. The operational matters, actually, I think, of more for the executive than for the board. You know, the CEO is accountable for the operations of the company, and the CEO is accountable to the board.
In your role as shareholder non-executive director, how do you determine whether and to what extent you should involve yourself in operational matters concerning the Post Office?
I like to have a high level, like other board members, I like to have a high level understanding of what is happening at an operational level, because that is the performance of the company. I don't involve myself in operational matters, generally speaking, beyond those that come to the whole board.
In her evidence to the inquiry, Amanda Burton, one of your colleagues in the Post Office board, stated that you personally requested to be involved in overseeing an investigation into a whistleblowing complaint made against the CEO. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
Why was that? Because
I think that it's of interest to the shareholder. The CEO is the most most senior employee of the company. He is a board director. I think it is appropriate that an appointee appointed by the shareholder. The behaviour and conduct of the CEO, I think, is a pertinent issue to the shareholder, because it impacts the culture of the organisation.
You say in your statement that a risk-averse culture has developed in the Post Office, which you attribute, I think at least in part, to the intense scrutiny of this inquiry and to the media. Is that right?
Yes, it is.
Has the intervention by the shareholder and by its representative non-executive director been a contributing factor, do you think, in the development of that particular culture?
I think it's a good question. The shareholder provides a very significant degree of scrutiny to Post Office, particularly relating to funding requests, which I think are rightly a matter for the shareholder. If the shareholder has been asked for funds, then I think it is completely legitimate that the Post Office has to provide a business case and scrutiny to that. I actually don't think the shareholder intervenes significantly outside of the processes that are set out in the governance documents. So I think on the IT programme, there's probably something in the idea that there is a high level of scrutiny from the shareholder, and that has made people very conscious of the decisions they're making. I think rightly so when they're spending public money, but I don't think the shareholder has contributed more widely than that.
In terms of striking a balance between, on the one hand, exercising effective oversight of the Post Office, and on the other, affording its board and management team sufficient autonomy to make decisions, do you think that you, in your role as shareholder non-executive director, are currently striking the right balance?
So I think part of the context for this question and discussion is the ongoing and very frequent requests for funding that have come from Post Office over the course of the last 2 to 3 years into government. As I just described, I think it is entirely right and proper that government provides scrutiny to the spending of what is ultimately taxpayers' money. I think the Post Office gets a lot of scrutiny from government in terms of its funding plans and spending of taxpayers' money. I think that outside of that, the shareholder and my they're slightly distinct. The shareholders' interventions are set out in the governance documents, and they are in line with the governance documents. I am a non-executive director of the company. I provide scrutiny as any other non-executive director does, and not beyond that.
In your statement, you acknowledge the frustration expressed by some board members about the level of intervention by the shareholder non-executive director in board meetings. Have those sentiments prompted you to reflect upon whether you are striking the right balance currently in that role?
So my understanding is that those concerns were raised prior to my time joining the board, and that there are not concerns, or I have not had concerns reflected to me, or as I understand it, to UKGI, about my interventions in meetings. That said, I can understand where the question comes from, not least because the shareholder representative is a proxy for the views of the shareholder, and where the views of the shareholder are pertinent to a decision that is being made, I think it is helpful to have those reflected into the board. I think there's sometimes a little bit of confusion between the extent to which the shareholder representative is sort of making a decision themselves or giving their own views, rather than being a conduit for or a sort of good proxy for the views of the minister. And I think that the views of the minister and the shareholder are often a thing that is helpful for the board to hear, for them to understand how a proposal that they've got is likely to be received by the department.
Speaking more generally about this governance issue, you say at paragraph 31 of your statement that it's your view that the principles that apply to purely commercial companies need to be tailored to take account of the policy considerations that underline publicly owned assets. Can you please explain, insofar as you haven't done so already, in precisely what way you consider those principles need to be tailored? I'm happy to take you to it, if that would
I'll just find it if that's all right.
Help to give it context. It's page 15 of your statement at WITN 11310-100.
So I'm very happy to expand on that. So I think there are considerations for companies that are owned by government that are a bit different to companies that are privately held or listed companies. For example, the approach to settlement agreements with staff So in the public sector, arm's length bodies do not have the ability to make settlement agreements with staff. So that is essentially reaching an agreement where you are paying a member of staff to leave. And that is a principle set out by Treasury to ensure that public funds are well used and to incentivise good management rather than exiting people out of the business without having followed a process. That is not typically done. So in commercial organisations, they typically have a freedom to reach an agreement and pay someone to go. That is not a thing that can happen in the public sector.
So that being one example of that
Yeah.
tailoring, can you provide any specific examples in relation to your interactions with the Post Office where you think those principles need tailoring?
I also think remuneration would be another example of that, I think. So remuneration in the public sector is a matter of public record, and ministers feel strongly that those who serve in public corporations and for the government should have a sense of social purpose around what they do as well, and remuneration rates are not as high in the public sector in many instances as they are in commercial organisations.
Do you consider the issues relating to remuneration have been a significant problem during your tenure as shareholder non-executive director?
At Post Office, yes. When I was a NED at Sheffield Forgemasters, no.
And why is that?
Well, I think the issues relating to the Post Office CEOs, the requests for pay increases are sort of well documented and have attracted a lot of attention.
Thank you. If I could move on, please, to ask some brief questions about the mechanisms that exist in UKGI for recording and reporting on risks relating to the Post Office. Could we please bring up the statement again at page 15? Paragraph 33, please. Thank you. So this is in relation to UKGI's internal risk reporting. You say this provides a mechanism to identify, escalate and manage risks faced by UKGI in exercising its mandate. These risks predominantly relate to UKGI's ability to provide sound advice to client departments and for UKGI shareholder non-executive directors and shareholder teams to perform their roles effectively. These are not the same, you point out, as the risks being faced by the assets directly. Do you know why it is that risks faced by the government's assets, such as the Post Office, are not captured in UKGI's internal risk registers?
Because they're captured elsewhere through different processes. So Post Office, the CEO of Post Office is, in government speak, an accountable person, and the accountable person reports their risk into the principal accounting officer, which is to say the Post Office reports its risk into the shareholder, as in the department, and the department's board and the principal accounting officer is ultimately responsible there. And in UKGI, the UKGI board is responsible for UKGI's risks and our operational risks, which are primarily around things like resourcing, are we getting traction with the department, that kind of thing.
Given the supervisory nature of the role that UKGI performs in relation to assets such as the Post Office, do you think that risks relating to those assets ought to be captured within UKGI's internal risk registers?
No, because I think that they are adequately dealt with and managed elsewhere. Now, we provide a lens into the department on Post Office's risks, and the risk reporting, there's a formal element to it, and then I, as a board member, will also have a view because I sit on the Post Office Art Committee, and I will provide a sort of additional layer into the department if I think that there is anything that's not been captured, or I think that there is anything that needs to have their particular attention drawn to it. But that is the mechanism for doing it, rather than through the UKGI board, because the UKGI board ultimately don't have any levers over Post Office, right? The levers sit with the shareholder, who is the department.
You've mentioned the CEO's role as accountable person. Does it follow that from UKGI's perspective, primary responsibility for risk reporting in relation to the Post Office rests with the CEO?
Yes.
But you've gone on to say, and you say in your statement, that you and your team complement that risk reporting by reporting issues of concerns identified as a result of your daily interactions with the Post Office. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
How do you judge whether an issue of operational performance requires to be reported to the department?
I think that's a really good question, and ultimately it's a matter of judgment, and there are lots of things that sort of feed into one making a judgment call. There are some things that the department's got risk appetite statements, right? There are some things that it is very clear to me, the department has told me that they are very concerned about in terms of sort of financial performance, budgets, that sort of things. And then there will be other things that are of particular concern to the department for historical reasons or for other operational reasons. So, for example, and I'm sure we may come on to this, the discrepancies, the survey that was done by the inquiry, the YouGov survey, with the responses from postmasters about how frequently they were experiencing discrepancies. That is of great concern to the department. It's also of great concern to the Post Office board. I raised it outside of the sort of normal risk reporting process and talked to the department about what they wanted to do about it.
Some of your risk reporting to the department is conducted formally in the presence of the Post Office executive, such as in the context of the quarterly shareholder meetings. Is that correct?
That's not our risk reporting. That is Post Office's risk reporting to the department.
But which you would complement in the context of those meetings?
Probably not. I'd probably talk to them outside of the meetings.
I think, therefore, it follows that the bulk of your risk reporting takes place in private meetings and communications with the Department Director, Carl Creswell.
Yes.
And the Director General, David Bickerton. Is that correct?
Indeed, yes.
Is there sufficient transparency, do you think, in the reporting of risk by UKGI to the department insofar as it concerns the Post Office? Yes,
absolutely. So we do currently our process is we do a monthly note in addition to so Post Office do the quarterly shareholder meetings with the department. My team do a monthly note where we provide any updates or any additional issues. That goes to David Bickerton and to the Permanent Secretary and to ministers. And then I have conversations on top of that with David and with Carl. If there's something particularly pertinent outside of those meetings, I will send them an email or.
Forgive me, by transparency, you've answered the question with reference to how those interactions are recorded.
Right.
And that's fair, I didn't clarify. But do you think those interactions are sufficiently transparent to the Post Office? And should they be?
In the vast majority of cases, I am not saying anything to the department that I wouldn't say to the Post Office. That is not true in every case, and nor should it be true in every case, because I am there to represent the shareholder with a particular, view of what the shareholder is going to be interested in.
Do you think that those private channels of communication with the department risk undermining the Post Office board and the senior executive team in their governance and management of the Post Office?
No, I don't. Having said I don't say anything I wouldn't say to. There occasionally I do say things that I wouldn't say to Post Office. I almost always share my views very openly with other board colleagues. So perhaps not with the management team, but always with other board colleagues.
You refer in your statement to a recent review of the department's risk reporting and analysis by the Government Internal Audit Agency. You say that the review made a recommendation concerning the alignment of risk appetite as between the Post Office and the department. Is that correct?
Yes.
Can you please explain the basis on which that recommendation was made?
The Government Internal Audit Agency so the findings of their report was that the relationship works effectively, and they did not have concerns at a high level about us performing the shareholder role on behalf of the department. They made a number of recommendations that are quite administrative in nature around taking more notes of meetings, producing a document that says who does what rather than everybody just knowing who does what. And it was the same thing on the risk appetite. So I have a good understanding, because I talk to Carl Creswell almost every day about the department's risk appetite. This was about sort of formalising that through risk appetite statements.
Is there or has there been a misalignment, in your view, between the risk appetite of the company and the department?
No.
According to your statement, the review also recommended that sources of risk assurance available to the Post Office should be shared with the department. Is that correct?
I don't recall that, but if that is true, then that is true.
If we could just take a quick look, please, at page 19 of Ms. Gratton's statement. It's at paragraph 42.
Oh, right, yeah.
So it's just that final sentence. Do you know to what reference is being made there in terms of sources of risk assurance within the Post Office?
I actually don't know. I can't recall what those sources would be. My best guess would be that it would be internal audit type reports, but I'm afraid I can't provide any more information.
And do you know whether those are routinely shared with the department?
They are not routinely shared with the department, no. The department could ask to see them if they wish to.
Thank you. I'd like to move on then, please, to another topic, this time concerning the composition of the Post Office Board.
Yeah.
The statement can come down, thank you. Although it will come back up shortly. You say in your statement, or rather you discuss in your statement, the contribution which Mr. Elliot Jacobs and Mr. Saf Ishmael have made as Postmaster non-executive directors of the Post Office Board. I wonder if we could please just take a look at page 39, paragraph 84, where you describe that contribution which they've made. Thank you. So you say this, in my opinion, Mr. Jacobs and Mr. Ishmael have added a huge amount of value to the board. They've changed the nature of discussions at board level and ensure that the actual experiences of postmasters are heard. In my experience, they've been listened to, particularly when discussing issues relating to how policies and practices contained in board papers will affect postmasters on the ground. And if we could go over the page, please. You've given an example there to ways in which they've made a valid contribution. You say at the end of paragraph 84, their perspective on this issue and other important issues, particularly those that affect the Post Office's cost base and therefore ultimately have a significant effect on postmasters' livelihoods, has been invaluable. You go on in the following paragraph to discuss, however, some of the problems which have arisen from the appointment of postmasters to the Post Office Board. You say there have plainly been some issues in the way in which postmasters but the postmaster non-executive directors have been inducted and integrated onto the board, there were also occasions when they did not fully distinguish between their role as directors with the fiduciary duties that this entails and their position as both active postmasters and representatives of the wider postmaster community. Can you please explain a little more clearly what you mean by their failure fully to distinguish between their role as directors and their position as postmasters and representatives of that community?
So as I say at the beginning of that section, I think Elliot and Saf have added huge amounts of value to the Post Office Board, and they have genuinely changed. Well, I wasn't on the board before. My understanding is they've completely changed the dynamic in the boardroom by bringing their kind of perspective and lived experience as postmasters to the discussion. I touched earlier on Post Office's financial position, which is not a healthy one. And the budget discussions annually are very tricky in Post Office because the company is not able to pay postmasters as much remuneration as it would like to because there are insufficient funds available. And there are many reasons for that. And, you know, potentially had things been done differently in the past in terms of cost-saving measures, there may be more funds available now, but the situation now is what it is. And I think it's occasionally, well, certainly this year in the budget discussions, I think Mr. Ishmael and Mr. Jacobs found the position really difficult to accept, and I understand why they found it difficult to accept. It is, broadly speaking, not an acceptable position. But as a director of the company, you need to ensure the company continues to be a going concern and has a balanced budget. And I think they found that interaction very difficult.
I'd like to ask you some questions. The statement can come down, please. I'd like to ask you some questions about a meeting which you attended with Minister Hollingrig on the 29th of February 2024. We have a readout of that meeting, please, at bay 0000753. Thank you. So the subject of the email is Nick Reed readout, 29th of February. Is this an example of the quarterly shareholder meetings which we discussed earlier?
No, it's not. It's a monthly meeting that the Minister had with Nick Reed and some other Post Office executives that myself and Carl would regularly attend.
Thank you. So we see there a list of attendees as the Post Office CEO, and you're there on behalf of UKGI, and as you say, Mr. Creswell is the director of the department. This meeting comes shortly after the dismissal of the Post Office Chair, Henry Staunton, is that correct?
It is, yes.
We'll return to that topic a little later, but that provides relevant background to the discussion in this meeting, is that right? Shortly after the meeting starts, we see you make the following comment. So your first contribution is there saying, need as much support as you can get from Ben Tiswell to try and get the board functioning properly. We need to try and find a way through the Project Pineapple memo. The Project Pineapple memo was a reference to concerns raised by both postmaster non-executive directors about the prevailing culture within the post office, which they perceive to be hostile to postmasters. Is that correct?
I think that is part of it. That memo had been sent on, understand inadvertently, to the group executive members by the CEO. So it had also had quotes of it published in the Times. So the issue isn't just the memo. They expressed legitimate concerns. I think the issue is that memo had been sent on to the people who they referred to in the note. They had received that note, and the note in part had been made public. It had a really damaging impact on the relationship between the postmaster non-execs and the executives in the company. So aside from the sort of completely valid concerns that they're raising, it had caused a huge amount of friction in the relationship between the postmaster non-execs and the executive team.
What did you mean exactly when you said we need to try and find a way through the memo?
There was I think, a disagreement about who needed to apologise to who between the postmaster non-execs and some of the executive team. That it was a sort of very unpleasant personal situation in which I think quite a few people felt quite upset about what had happened, and not just Saf and Elliot.
So are you saying there that your concerns as articulated there related to the manner rather than the substance of the complaints that have been raised?
Yeah.
We can see a little further down a further discussion about the role of the postmaster and non-executive directors. Nick Reed, the CEO, says this goes back to whether the postmaster directors are playing a role of a director or of a trade union rep. I don't know where that is going to go. They're extremely exposed as a result of Project Pineapple, not sure how to patch this up in a slight standoff. You say that they're not in a good place and aren't operating in a way appropriate for the business. One of the specific issues raised in the Project Pineapple memo concerned the retention of employees whose actions in relation to Horizon have been the subject of criticism. Is that fair?
Yes, it is.
Do you recall that being one of the issues raised?
Yes, I think so, yeah.
Did you share the postmaster's concerns about the extent of cultural change which have been achieved within the post office by January 2024?
Yes, absolutely.
If you were sympathetic with the concerns raised by Mr. Jacobs and Mr. Ishmael, why did you not say so in this meeting?
The discussion that is taking place in this meeting is particularly around the relationship that they're having with the executive team at the moment. So I mentioned a couple of minutes ago about the budget discussions that were really tense. There had been a meeting the prior week, I think, where Saf and Elliot had met some of the finance team, and I understand the executives in that meeting had found the meeting slightly distressing because of the approach that they took in the meeting. And I don't think it is the role of non-executive directors to be aggressive and upsetting to staff members. So that is what this is about, rather than the concerns that they expressed in the memo. So it's about behaviour rather than the memo itself.
And so when you say that they aren't operating in a way appropriate for the business, it's your evidence that that relates to aggressive behaviour reported to you as directed at post office staff?
Yes, and just to be really clear, this is a point in time, right? This isn't my general view about Saf and Elliot, at all. They were under huge amounts of stress. They'd had journalists, outside their houses, and were getting an awful lot of criticism. And, nobody is their best self when they are under stress. And at this particular time, the relationship was quite tense, and I think there were a number of people who weren't behaving in a way where I think in hindsight they wish they had. But it is about this time. That is not my general view. I have an awful lot of time for Elliot and Saf, and I think they've made a huge contribution.
A little later in the meeting, there's some discussion about postmaster representation in the business. Please could we turn to the second page of this readout where we can see that discussion, please, halfway down. Thank you. So we see a comment from the Minister which reads, in terms of other messaging, the mutualisation has died down a bit. The CEO then comments, met on Monday, VOTP, etc. Do you know what that's referring to?
Voice of the Postmaster.
So their main point was about future of post office and representation of postmasters. we're going to see some governance work done by Grant Thornton in a few weeks' time. You say, or you're recorded as saying, I don't think postmaster oversight of the board is worth it. I think there's good mileage for more postmaster input in the retail part of the business. Can you please explain your comments there?
So this looks like a verbatim note of the meeting. It isn't. There is a lot of paraphrasing in this note, and I can't imagine I would have used the phrase worth it, because it's not the sort of thing I would have said. However, I stand by the comments. So this is referring to the NSFP's proposal to have a sort of parallel board, basically an oversight board of postmasters made up of postmasters and other stakeholders. I don't think that is the right way to get postmaster engagement in post office. An oversight board, by definition, aren't decision makers, and I think you need postmasters involved in the decision making, not just at board level, which they currently are, but actually all the way down the business at an operational level too, because the board, by definition, isn't operational. So I think there should be, you know, some sort of franchise type council looking at the business side of it with products and services and marketing material. And then I think there should also be postmaster engagement and interaction in other areas that are rightly areas of concern for postmasters. So they be that in kind of decisions around discrepancies and investigations, or whether or not, you know, the back office systems are working correctly. So I think you need it at all levels, not just sort of parked over there as a separate oversight board. I think if you want, if the idea of that is that the board's not working properly, you should get a different board, not create another one that's going to add some more bureaucracy and process to it.
In terms of you referred to a proposal to establish a council within the post office to provide input on operational matters.
Yes.
What practical steps are being taken to implement that proposal, do you know?
So the new management team are actually taking these ideas really seriously. So they've been holding a series over the summer with Voice of the Postmaster and NSFP and other representatives, and they've obviously been attended. I've been to a couple of those sessions. My understanding is that the proposals that are coming out of that, whilst not finalised, are being taken forward and will be implemented. I'm sure we'll come on to the discrepancies and like, but they are also working with representatives from Voice of the Postmaster and NSFP to look at the integrity of the current system and to do a review of the current system with a third-party provider, and those groups and other postmasters will be involved both in the terms of reference and sitting alongside the people doing the work to provide a view and reassurance and input into that work. So it is something that is very much live at the moment, and changes are being made.
And do you think those steps will be sufficient to make the company more postmaster-centric?
I think it's a place to start, and I think you've got to start, see where you get to, iterate and make it better.
I'd like to move on to ask you some questions about your role as the non-executive director of the Post Office Board. In your statement, you referred to UKGI's portfolio operating principles. Can you explain what these are, please?
Yes, certainly. So it is a sort of, if you will, like a kind of target operating model for UKGI of stuff we should be doing. So it's broadly speaking, making sure that the company has got good corporate governance oversight. It sets out sort of activities basically to be performed, that there are objectives for the company, business plans in place, that the corporate capability within the company is effective, that the leadership within the company is effective, that there's good relationships with the department, and then the sort of contribution of the shareholder, NED. So it sort of sets out how we should be doing our jobs.
Is it right that these, I think you say these principles provide guidance about the performance of your role as a UKGI NED on the Post Office Board? On the one hand, they acknowledge that your duties are the same as those of all the other directors on the Post Office Board, and include the duty to promote the success of the company. Is that correct?
Yes, it is, yes.
And on the other hand, they expect you, in your role as UKGI NED, to act as an interlocutor between the shareholder and the company with a view to delivering the department's policy objectives. Is that fair?
Yes.
You say in your statement that this dual function does not in practice present problems for you. Is that right?
That's my view, yes.
You suggest it's because it's in the Post Office's best interests to comply with the shareholders' policy objectives. Is that fair?
That is why the Post Office exists, yes.
You say, in effect, if the Post Office fails to comply, it will not receive the government subsidy on which it's currently reliant to remain as a going concern.
So there is a funding agreement that sets out that it must meet the policy, which is not with UKGI, it's with the department, that sets out that they must meet the policy objectives in order to receive the subsidy, yes.
What if Post Office, as a commercial company, took the view that its financial interests were best served by foregoing the government subsidy and relieving itself of the social function, the obligation it has to perform a social function? Would there not then be a direct conflict between the dual role that you're performing?
I can see that in that situation there would be. That is not the situation in which we find ourselves. So I'm not saying there could never be a conflict. I am saying that I have not experienced a conflict, and that at UKGI we've got a lot of training and support of how to approach those conflicts should they arise, but I have not personally, the situation you've described is not one that is obtained.
But we did discuss earlier on a situation in which the Post Office might focus upon its commercial function and a network that's capable of being financially sustainable. And that's one in which you then saw the government subsidies being tied specifically to those aspects of the network which are not financially self-sufficient. So do you not anticipate in the Post Office's future that there could well be a direct conflict in the dual role that you're performing?
No, I don't, because the policy framework is, so I think the government announced on Monday, I think, that they're doing a green paper which will look at the policy framework for Post Office, and that will be the subject of a call for evidence, I would imagine, and Post Office will contribute to that. And there will be a dialogue with Post Office and between the Post Office and government about where that will end up. It is not something that I anticipate there being conflict over, though if there is, it will be managed appropriately.
Thank you. So that brings me to the end of that particular topic. I wonder if now would be a convenient time to take our first morning break.
By all means, yeah. So what time shall we resume?
Shall we resume at 11:05?
Yeah, that's fine.
Good morning, sir.
Ring again.
I'd like to move on to another topic, please, concerning the Post Office's redress and compensation schemes. Now, is it right that you and your team are not directly involved in the administration of those schemes, but in your capacity as non-executive director, you sit on the Post Office's remediation committee, which oversees the administration of Post Office's redress and compensation schemes?
Yes, that's exactly right.
One of the concerns which you raise in your statement about the administration of the Horizon shortfall scheme relates to the conduct of the Post Office's lawyers. Is that right?
Yes.
You describe feeling concerned about what you say is a conventional legalistic approach that was adopted by the Post Office's external lawyers to the negotiation of settlements with claimants. Is that right?
Yes, and to be clear, that is Post Office's external lawyers rather than the people in Post Office.
What caused you to have those concerns?
So at the remediation committee, until quite recently, the Post Office's external lawyers attended the committee and they would give updates on various cases. And some of those updates would involve, they would recount, to my mind, having disputing relatively small amounts of money. And I just don't think that's the right way that they should be approaching it, both from a sort of administrative point of view. I don't think Herbert Smith spending time disputing a small amount of money is a good use of taxpayers' money, but much more importantly, like, that is a bad experience for claimants, and in the scheme of things, it's just not a big deal. And I think that they should have been taking a less kind of commercial approach to it and much more of a sort of benefit of the doubt, yes, within the parameters set out within the scheme, but I just didn't think arguing over small amounts of money is the right approach to take to people who have suffered terrible harms at the Townsend Post Office.
And can I just ask you, before we go any further, was this attitude an attitude which was prevailing in the administration of HSS or of OC, or both?
I recall it being related to HSS,
Right.
rather than OC.
Yeah.
When did that issue of focusing on, as you say, small matters of detail first become apparent to you?
It has been apparent to me since I have been on the committee, and other committee members felt similarly to me that, you know, we should just be getting on with it, not having an argument over £1,500 or whatever the amount is.
So I think you said in your statement you shared your concerns with the remediation committee, and what you appear to say is they agreed with you in relation to those concerns. Is that correct?
Yes, and shared them directly with the lawyers, because the lawyers are at the committee. So this isn't a thing that we were sort of talking about behind the lawyers' backs, so to say. This is a thing I said directly to the lawyers involved.
And you feel that message was getting across?
I am not convinced that the message was getting across.
I would like to, why do you think that is, firstly?
I think that some of the lawyers felt quite, I think that they, and this is speculation, right? I don't know how they felt. My impression was they'd been very involved in the development of the scheme, and there was a little bit of this is just how commercial negotiation is done. You don't understand sort of approach to it. Whereas my point of view was, this is the Post Office, it is different. Your commercial approach is not an appropriate one.
Ordinarily, lawyers act on their instructions, and if their instructions are to achieve a settlement, and not necessarily at the lowest figure that settlement might be achieved, then one would expect them to give effect to that. Was the issue in relation to the instructions that were being given, or in the willingness of your lawyers to give effect to them?
I don't know, to be honest. It was an issue that came up more than once at the committee. I don't know whether or not. My sense is that the approach gradually changed, but it was not the experience I was expecting to have, which is committee tells you to do something, you go and do the thing.
And do you consider that the committee was supported? Was the committee supported by the Post Office executive team in giving effect to that direction?
I think so. Certainly, Mr. Ricalden at the committee was of a similar view. I don't know what happened in terms of the sort of actual written instructions that are then given to the lawyer.
You have answered a question just now from the chair about the overturned conviction scheme, and you've explained that your concerns about the law is related primarily to the historical shortfall scheme, the Horizon shortfall scheme. But I would like to discuss with you some of the changes that were made during your tenure to the overturned conviction scheme. You explain in your statement that concerns about the speed with which claims were being resolved led the Post Office to adopt a different approach based on agreed principles rather than the negotiated settlement approach that had been adopted hitherto. Is that correct?
Are you referring to the 600,000 fixed payment?
Well, that's a separate issue in the sense that you say in your statement that in parallel with the development of policy in relation to that, the Post Office was separately developing a set of agreed principles by which it planned to take forward settlement of claims made under the overturned conviction scheme. Do you recall that?
Yeah, do you mean the Lord Dyson principles, the early neutral evaluation principles?
So I think if I refer you to your statement, that may be the easiest way. So it's if we could turn up, please, it's page 90.
Yes, yeah.
Thank you. So you say when you started in your role, the Post Office was piloting its remediation principles in the assessment of pecuniary claims. This is under the overturned conviction scheme, and had shared a first tranche of draft principles with claimant representatives, and that your team had supported the department in its review of the draft principles and the Post Office's proposed future ways of working. You explain that under this new approach, the Post Office's case assessors would review claims received from claimants and prepare offers consistent with the case principles agreed with the claimant representatives, the aim being to reach settlement faster than had been possible under the previous negotiated approach, where case principles had not been agreed in advance with the representatives. So that was an initiative on the one hand being taken by the Post Office. Is that fair?
So this started before my time on the board. So I joined the board in May, and the adoption of the principles was already kind of well in train by the time I started. So I don't know where it originated from, but yes, it was the process that was in train.
In parallel with the development of that approach, a new policy was developed by the Department of Business and Trade to make a final settlement offer of £600,000 to applicants under the scheme. Is that correct?
Yes.
What did you understand to be the reasons for the adoption of that new policy?
So the work on this was largely done by the department. There was some input from my team, not really from me personally, but from people working to me. So I wasn't close to it. My understanding is that it was meant to provide a route for people who didn't want to go through a process with Post Office. You know, people have suffered greatly at the hands of the Post Office, and I have a lot of sympathy for claimants not wanting to deal directly with the Post Office and go through a long, protracted process with them because the claims are taking a very long time to process. This was meant to be a much quicker way of resolving those with less interaction, and enabled people to get redress quicker if that is what they felt was appropriate for them. Now, if people still wanted to go through the process because they thought they had a much higher value claim, then that was still available. But this was meant to be a sort of alternative route to people to give them access to quicker redress if they thought they had a lower value claim or just wanted to get it done quickly.
Was the decision to introduce the new settlement offer driven by a desire to reduce the amount of money being spent on legal fees associated with the settlement of these claims?
No, so it wasn't driven by the desire to reduce the amount of legal fees. It was done as an intention to be a genuinely good thing for claimants, to give people an alternative. I think there is an effect where there is a lower administration cost of the claim, but that was not the principal motivation behind it. It was meant to be a thing that would be good for claimants.
But it was anticipated, I think you say, that early acceptance of a fixed sum offer would bring savings in terms of avoiding the expense of disclosure and legal advice associated with a more protracted settlement process.
Yes, absolutely.
Did the anticipated reduction in legal spend, do you know, affect the amount at which the offer was fixed?
I think that you heard the inquiry heard at length from Sarah Mumby earlier in the week about the kind of value for money assessment for offers and the like. I think there was an amount sort of assumed to be foregone legal fees that was included in the offer amount with a view to making the value for money case.
Were you aware of a sentiment within the Post Office that it had thus far been working within a framework which had been agreed with the government and which was informed by a concern to ensure that public funds were used responsibly?
Sorry,
were you aware of a sentiment within the Post Office, and particularly within those responsible for remediation, that they had hitherto been working within a framework which had been agreed with government and which had been informed by the need to ensure that public funds were used responsibly?
Yes, but I think that is the case with all spending by all government-owned bodies. There is an obligation on the accounting officer to ensure that the funds are used responsibly.
Do you think it would be fair to say that the introduction of this fixed sum offer shifted the goalposts for the Post Office in terms of how it was expected to approach the settlement of claims?
I mean, on one level, it's a very different approach, yes, but I think that it is legitimate to have two different routes to do this and to reiterate the approach as you learn from what has happened in the past. And my understanding is that the claims were taking much, much longer to process than had initially been anticipated, and that the ratio of administrative cost to amount of compensation paid out was not what people had anticipated either, and that the experience of postmasters was just not good enough. And so this was meant to be a way to address some of those concerns, primarily the experience of postmasters. I think it's perfectly legitimate to have two different ways of doing it.
Is there any merit, do you think, in the suggestion that the Post Office had, prior to the introduction of this offer, been constrained in its ability to make generous and decisive offers by the framework, the governance framework, which is agreed with the government?
I think that there is almost always with spending of public funds evidence required. I think that is a legitimate thing when you're spending what is ultimately taxpayers' money. I don't think the anticipation wasn't that the process should stop Post Office making generous and decisive offers to people. Whether included in generous, was it quick enough? No, absolutely not. And this was meant to be a way to help make it quicker.
Thank you. I'd like to address a new topic, please, which concerns the governance of the programme to replace Horizon. That's the programme we know is the new branch IT programme. Now, you attended a meeting of the Post Office Board in March 2023, shortly before you took up your appointment as non-executive director. Is that correct?
Yes.
At that meeting, you were attending as an observer. Is that right?
Yes.
One of the issues raised at the meeting related to cost increases in the programme. Is that correct?
I believe so, yes.
Please could we look at the minutes of that meeting, which bear the reference POL 00448789. Thank you. So, minutes of the board meeting of the 9th of March 2023. If we could go scroll down, please, to page 4. We can see there agenda item number 3 relating to the revised MBIT forecast. At the third, I'd like to look, please, at the third paragraph, which reads as follows. So, at ZM, that would be Mr. Mladenov. Is that correct? Reference to ZM.
Yeah, Dravko. I don't know his name. Yeah.
Mladenov. He spoke to the revised MBIT forecast and financials update, detailing the main drivers for the costs increase. It then says a C would be Alistair Cameron. Is that right? Noted that the level of assurance being requested from end to end was such that, if agreed to, the project team would not be able to build at the same pace as currently, and a conversation on this needed to be had with the shareholder. Then said ZP emphasised the need to have the right assurance strategy, which should focus on aspects of the project that were particularly risky. ZM noted a paper on the MBIT assurance programme was due to come to the 28th of March board. ZP advised it would be useful for the board to understand testing. ZM replies detailing the system testing and business acceptance testing. Was this the first occasion on which concerns about the future viability and funding of the MBIT programme were raised with you, or in your presence?
In my presence, yes. This is, I think, the first board meeting I attended, so I don't know whether it had been discussed previously.
Had you received any prior briefing from your predecessor, Tom Cooper, or from the shareholder team about problems or concerns in relation to the MBIT programme? I cannot recall precisely. I very much imagine Mr. Cooper held concerns. I imagine he would have expressed those to me. What was your perception at this stage in March 2023 about the seriousness of the issues being faced by the programme?
I didn't have a good understanding of the programme. As I say, this is the first meeting I had attended, and I don't think I'd had briefings from the team in Post Office yet at this point. I didn't know very much about it at all at this point.
Do you happen to know what, if any, oversight from the briefings that you received, do you know what, if any, oversight the Post Office Board and the shareholder team had in relation to the procurement, the early procurement of the new system?
I know that there had been a proposal that had gone through the investment committee, as was the base. I don't know beyond that, I'm afraid.
You later attended a meeting with the Post Office Minister in April, the following month, in which the programme was discussed again. We have a readout of that meeting at Bays quadruple 00653, please. Thank you. So this is the CEO's monthly meeting with the Minister on the 18th of April 2023. The principal issue raised by the CEO at this meeting concerned the decision of the Permanent Secretary to withhold funding. Is that correct? Do you recall?
Yeah, did you say this is April?
I think it's the 18th of
Yeah. Yes,
April.
I do. I do recall. Yeah.
Can you please explain the background to the decision to withhold funding from the Post Office?
Yes. So Post Office is funded for under. Well, it's now funded for many things. At the time, it was funded under the subsidy control regime for the uneconomic part of the network, so they call that the network subsidy, and also for investment funding. The investment funding is dispersed from the department twice a year. I think it's 150 million quid each time, I think. And the network funding is dispersed, I think, quarterly. The dispersal requires the approval of the Permanent Secretary. And so typically my team writes a submission that says, Permanent Secretary, are you happy to disperse the funds, and give some additional context. This was immediately after the Bays had been split up into the business department and energy department and science department. And so it was now a new Permanent Secretary dealing with Post Office. So Post Office went to the business department. It was now no longer Sarah Mumby, who was Permanent Secretary, and is now Gareth Davies, who's the Permanent Secretary. So this was the first submission that had gone to Gareth Davies to say, are you happy to release the network subsidy? The subsidy, as I mentioned previously, is set that the sort of conditions for it are set out in a funding agreement with Post Office, and it says a bunch of things that they have to do in order to release the funding. The most sort of high profile of which are maintain the branch network numbers and so the policy obligations. There are also a number of other conditions in the letter, such as have a 3-year business plan, have your budget approved, that sort of thing. Post Office didn't have a 3-year business plan in place, in part because their settlement from the 2021 spending review, which I think Sarah Mumby talked about, was lower than they had hoped, and they had found it very difficult to put together a 3-year plan. Because the conditions for funding were technically not met, the Permanent Secretary decided to withhold funding.
You said that it was part of the role of your team to put up a submission to the Permanent Secretary on the funding issue. Did that contain advice to the Permanent Secretary to withhold funding?
No, it didn't.
If we could look, please, at what the CEO had to say in relation to the reasons why Post Office was I suppose experiencing issues in relation to its funding. He said this, that the main issues are that firstly the Horizon replacement. In relation to the Horizon replacement, Post Office had underestimated the cost of this. He referred also to inquiry costs and to compensation. In the paragraph that follows, you're recorded as saying that UKGI and department officials are working together to provide reassurance to the Permanent Secretary about cost controls. Is that a reference to cost controls specifically in relation to the MBIT programme or more generally?
The so to just provide a little bit of context, the Permanent Secretary was completely new to Post Office, and I think was surprised at the degree of I call it out-of-cycle funding, so funding that was being asked for by Post Office outside the usual process. The usual process is spending reviews done every 1, 2, 3 years or whatever by Treasury. Post Office was making a significant number of requests for funding outside of that process. That is very unusual in a government context. It is very unusual in a government context. The Permanent Secretary, I think, was very surprised by that, and it had led him to take the view that Post Office did not have adequate control on its cost base.
Thank you. If we could go over the page, please. So at the top there, still on the issue of funding, you're recorded as saying that UKGI needed cost and time assurance from the for the funding request in relation to the rise and replacement, and not just quality assurance, which is what you had seen thus far. What quality assurance have been provided to UKGI at this stage concerning the programme to replace Horizon?
I'm afraid I can't recall.
Thank you. If that could come down, please. You attend a further meeting of the Post Office Board on the 5th of July 2023. This is the meeting at which whistleblowing allegations concerning the management of the MBIT programme are raised by the CEO, and in which it's acknowledged that there's a need for a better governance of the programme. Is that fair?
That is fair, yes.
I wonder if we could look, please, at the minutes of that meeting. They are POL 00448509. Thank you. If we could scroll down, please. And on to the second page. So the addendum item is the Speak Up, reference to the Post Office's whistleblowing policy, and concerns which have been raised under that policy relating to MBIT. You received in that meeting a detailed update from the CEO relating to the concerns and complaints raised by the whistleblower. By this stage, in early July, what was your perception as to the seriousness of the issues facing the programme?
My recollection is that I, like many of the other board members, thought the programme had extremely serious problems with it. I think the cost estimate, the updated cost estimate, was sort of multiples of the previous cost estimate, and the team were very, very clearly concerned about their ability to deliver to the timeline that had been set out. So yes, I think it's fair to say I and others were extremely concerned.
Thank you. If we could just look, please, at the bottom of page 2. So we see there in the final paragraph a recognition that there was a need to establish better governance across the programme, and a proposal by the chair, which is said to have been discussed with another member of the board concerning the establishment of a new committee, a board committee, which would include within its ambit responsibility for overseeing the ambit programme. Is it right that you say that that was your proposal, or a proposal that originated in UKGI?
So my predecessor on the board had been, my understanding has advocated for that, the introduction of that committee. He'd not got any traction, my understanding is, with the company on introducing that committee. At this point, the committee was introduced, yes.
Do you think there's merit in the suggestion that the board's approach to that issue was rather reactive? That is to say that no action was taken to address the governance issues in relation to the programme until this particular complaint was raised?
I do think that's fair, although from the complaint and the subsequent pieces of assurance that have been done on the programme, the governance issues are, the oversight of the board is not the only governance issue in the programme. My understanding is there were issues right the way down the programme in terms of governance. So setting up an investment committee, whilst a helpful step, was definitely not going to be a panacea.
But it was something which you say UKGI had been campaigning for, so far as you were, at least
Yes.
prior to your appointment. Yes. You were recorded in the minutes of the meeting as saying that you considered it was sensible to pause on MBIT with no regret activity continuing. Can you explain what you meant by that, please?
So when they were doing the programme, there was sort of a view that there was some activity that would have to carry on if the programme was to be able to deliver to its timeline, but there was some other activity that could be delayed, picked up at a later date. It was with a view to giving the programme some space to reconsider what it was it actually needed to do, whilst not impacting significantly on the timeline for delivery.
And what did you understand to be the dividing line between those activities which were necessary to continue and those which could be parked?
That's a question for the executive team rather than for me.
You wrote an email to colleagues in the department the same day, informing them about this particular complaint. Is that correct?
I think it was after the complaint. I think the email is relating to the complaint, isn't it?
Forgive me.
I think the email's relating to
Yes,
the complaint. Is it? Sorry, yes.
Raising
yes,
an
sorry,
email
raising, yeah.
Off the back of what you'd learned in the board meeting about
Yes.
the complaint. So that's please UKGI at 00049035. Just before we come to that email, I asked you earlier in your evidence whether you thought it was fair to characterise the response to issues in the programme as reactive, and you said you didn't think that was an unfair characterisation in the circumstances. Were you concerned that the very serious issues with the programme that were identified in that complaint had not reached the board via normal reporting channels?
Yes. So on one hand, it is a positive thing, I think, that whoever the whistleblower was in this circumstance came forward and felt able to use the Post Office's processes to make a complaint, and that complaint was taken seriously. On the other hand, the fact it has to come through a whistleblowing complaint rather than being picked up through the normal course of business with people being able to sort of speak to each other and address concerns openly does not reflect well.
And from what you understood about the complaint, why do you think it was that it ended up arising in that or reaching the board in that way?
I don't know, I'm afraid.
If we could look please at your email, so this is to Mr. Bickerton and Mr. Creswell in the department. You say you're right to make them aware of a short notice board meeting that was held earlier that morning following an extensive complaint made under the whistleblowing process. So this would be, I think you said earlier in your evidence, this would be a good example of you exercising your judgment to draw to the attention of the department what is on the face of it an operational matter, but one which you think is sufficiently serious to draw to their attention.
Yes.
On this occasion, because it related to a programme which affected the future viability of the network?
A number of reasons. There's obviously a long and very difficult history with Horizon. Replacing it is a priority for Post Office and for government. This called into question the programme to be able to do that. There was also a very significant funding request in from the Post Office to continue with the programme. I think it's quite difficult to fund a programme fully, to fully fund the request when you've been told there's an awful lot of problems with the programme. So I think it's pertinent on two levels.
You recall that the complaint is quite wide-ranging, but primarily related to the MBIT programme, alleging incompetent management of the programme, poor governance, and misleading information being given to the board. You point out it also made a wide range of conduct and behaviour allegations against senior members of staff. And you go on to say that the CEO of the Post Office has outlined a number of changes that he's proposing to make to the MBIT programme, the first of which is the commissioning of a review by KPMG and Accenture. Just pausing there, were you aware of concerns about the role of Accenture?
It's a very good question. I was not as aware as I would have liked to have been in hindsight about the role of Accenture. So Accenture were involved in the programme. They were providing contractors into the programme. My understanding at the point at which this is commissioned is that those contractors were quite junior people, and there's some people, but it's not a big deal. My subsequent understanding is that Accenture were much more involved in the programme than I had previously understood. So I think there's a good question about whether or not a review done by Accenture is appropriate, given that they are also contributing staff to the programme, how independent they could really be.
At this stage, I think it's fair to say you see the appointment of Accenture as a positive thing in providing assurance.
Yeah.
What you're saying now is that perhaps that assurance wasn't as concrete as you initially appreciated because of their prior and ongoing involvement.
So Accenture, I am sure, would say in the report that it's a different bit of the business. But I think that it is good practice to have a genuinely independent third party doing assurance.
And you've explained just now in your evidence your understanding of the scope of their role then was not as detailed as it is now. Why is it, or how is it that you've come to learn, to have a more fuller understanding of the extent of their involvement?
I actually can't recall. It must have been through discussion with somebody who was in the company who was, told me. I can't remember.
Do you consider that there was a failure of reporting to you in relation to Accenture and the role that they were being asked to perform?
I think the role of Accenture was probably underplayed when it was described to the board.
So you say in addition to that external review and assessment of the programme, the CEO is proposing to hire a new transformation director to oversee the programme. And of course you refer to the introduction of a new board committee, a request that you say we, UKGI, made of the company. And finally, a pause, reduction to minimal progress, no regrets activity on the programme whilst this is underway. You say this, to note there are a number of other similar whistleblowing allegations relating to the programme. I think the changes Nick is proposing to make are sensible and long overdue. Bearing in mind that you were obviously first aware of issues in relation to the programme in early March, albeit you said at that stage your understanding of them, I think, was quite limited. You were not yet in post as non-executive director. Why do you say there that you considered those particular changes to be long overdue?
So this is particularly on the hiring of a new transformation director. So when I started on the board, or when I was first an observer on the board, Post Office was running the programme to replace Horizon and introduce new branch technology as two separate parts. So they were treating the build of the new operating system for postmasters as distinct from the rollout of that technology into branches. And to my mind, it was quite a strange thing to do, to treat them as different things. And the MBIT programme, my understanding is it was quite isolated from the rest of the business, and it wasn't being kind of well integrated and treating this as an opportunity to sort of transform the business, make it easier to put products onto the system and, set the Post Office up for future success. It was being treated as a sort of IT project. My understanding is that the hiring of the transformation director would sort of bring that together. So, yes, I do think it was a thing that I'm surprised it was run like that in the first place.
Now, in relation to that new board committee, which became the investment committee, it held its inaugural meeting in or around late October of 2023. Is that correct?
I don't recall if that is what you say. I'm slightly surprised it's not till October, but that may be the case.
Well, there's a reference in Post Office Board minutes to its inaugural meeting, which appears to date it to October, but we can look into that. You say in relation to the work of that committee, you're conscious and you acknowledge frustrations being expressed by members of the committee about the level of assurance that the shareholder, or that you as shareholder representative, are seeking on behalf of the shareholder in relation to that particular programme. Is that correct?
Sort of. It is not me seeking the assurance, it is the shareholder seeking the assurance. I am relaying what the shareholder is going to require, which is a bit different, right? I'm not inventing the level of insurance that they need themselves. This is what the shareholder is going to require because of the level of public funds that are being spent.
And is it purely level of public funds, or is there wider concerns about the role of this new platform in replacing Horizon?
So I don't think there's concerns about the role of the new platform. The idea is that the new branch technology should equip postmasters with the tools to offer customers and communities the best service. I don't think anyone disputed that at all. Government-funded projects, when they reach a certain level of funding required or are particularly contentious or novel, have to go through a thing called the government's major projects process. And that is true across the whole public sector, and the scale of this programme meant that it was going to have to go through that process. And so that is not just a sort of, are you spending the money well? Is the programme going to do what it says it's going to do? Is it going to work as well?
Yeah. Is it going to deliver on?
Yeah, on the objective. Yeah.
On the objective. We saw in that board meeting in March, where issues were first raised in your presence about concerns in relation to the programme, that the level of assurance being sought was said to be something that was placing a particularly onerous financial burden on the Post Office. Mm-hmm. Do you have concerns about whether or not the mistakes that were made in the past in relation to Horizon have been or are being repeated in relation to the Post Office's handling of this particular programme?
So I think there's sort of two answers to that. Firstly, everybody in Post Office is acutely aware of the history of Horizon and is determined to undertake all the assurance necessary in order to ensure that the system is robust. Right, the people developing it are absolutely adamant that it needs to work and not suffer from the bugs and defects that have previously been present in Horizon. So I think everybody is sort of on board with that. In terms of the sort of wider assurance, sorry, I've forgotten the question that you asked me that led me to think I had two things to say.
Well, broadly speaking, the question was whether you had concerns, bearing in mind what was said about the onerousness of the assurance being sought, as to the Post Office's attitude to this particular programme and whether it was repeating the mistakes of the past.
So I don't think they were concerned or expressing concerns about assurance to make sure the system worked. I think everybody wanted assurance to make sure that the system worked. I think they were expressing concerns about what they saw to be additional government processes. So, for example, enrolling onto the government major projects programme thing, and the interventions of a thing called the Infrastructure Projects Authority, which is a bit of Cabinet Office that kind of gets involved when there are big projects. I think they saw that aspect of it as intrusive into Post Office's plans. My personal view is that that has been shown to have added quite a lot of value, because not only is it a right thing to do where taxpayers' money is being spent, but it has been demonstrated to add quite a lot of value as the new management team are rethinking the approach to the MBIT replacement, and I'm not sure that the plan that is under discussion here is going to be taken forward in its current form.
Forgive me, can you just repeat that? You're not sure that the plan...
So I think the current CEO, acting CEO of Post Office has sent a message to all Post Office staff to say that they are reviewing the current approach to MBIT, that the objective of providing postmasters with tools to offer customers and communities the best service remains the same, but they are reassessing the way in which they are going to deliver that objective.
Public funding that it requires is, I think you say, remains a highly challenging task.
Yes.
Can you just explain what you mean by the government's requirements for the level of public funding that it requires?
So Post Office, as I sort of mentioned earlier, is not cash generative, right? It loses money every year and is a going concern because the government provides annual support. Post Office does not have its own funds available to pay for the replacement of the in-branch technology. It is going to be wholly funded by the taxpayer. That funding is at a level at which it is well past the department's delegated authority. It's going to Treasury for approval, and Treasury take a view on the amount of money that they spend on programmes, and that is related to how much money the programme requires to deliver, but there are, in all cases, cheaper, more expensive ways of meeting objectives.
And what do you consider the relationship to be between ensuring that the replacement for Horizon is reliable and that the funding requirements of the government are met?
So absolutely nobody is making a trade-off about cost and reliability on the system. To be completely clear, there are lots of decisions about whether you employ Post Office staff in-house to do it, whether you have contractors who are on day rates to do it. There is probably a bit of a trade-off between speed and time as well. Delivering something faster often costs more money than delivering something at a slower pace. So nobody is questioning the fact you need a completely reliable system for the Post Office's IT. That is not what the cost control is about at all.
Thank you. So that brings me to the end of that particular topic. What I would propose is another short break of 10 minutes. I anticipate I'll be finished with Ms. Gratton shortly after that, and there'll be some questions from court participants to follow.
All right. So resuming at 12:10, or?
I think that would be fine, so thank you. Good afternoon, sir. Can you see and hear us?
Can, thank you.
Thank you. I have two further fairly brief topics to cover, please. The first relating to the dismissal of Mr. Staunton, former chair of the Post Office. That's a topic which has been covered at some length already in this inquiry, but one in which you had some direct personal involvement, and therefore I'd like to briefly touch upon it with you now. I think it's fair to say that you had a number of concerns about the conduct of the former chair of the Post Office. Those related first to his attitude to whistleblowing complaints that were made against other staff at the Post Office, and you cite the example of the whistleblowing complaint concerning MBITS, which we discussed a short time ago, and whether that was taken sufficiently seriously at the time by the chair. Secondly, you describe having concerns about a whistleblowing complaint which included allegations of the use of racist and misogynistic language by the chair himself. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Sorry, I'm conscious you're nodding.
Sorry,
It's purely
yes.
for the transcript. Thank you. You say in your statement that you had personally experienced dismissive conduct from the chair. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
That complaint, of course, was subject of an independent investigation, which concluded after the chair's dismissal. And I think the third area of concern related to the procedure for the appointment of a new senior independent director. Is that right?
Yes.
And particularly around irregularities in the procedure that was undertaken in relation to that appointment.
Yes.
What I want to ask you is whether your concerns about that appointment process were ones of form or of substance, or indeed of both.
My concerns were, sorry, by substance, do you mean the appointment of Andrew Darfur as the senior independent director?
Forgive me, but I should have explained, perhaps not in relation to him personally, but it's right, is it not? You'd earlier expressed a preference for a female board member to be appointed, and one in particular with Whitehall experience. Is that correct?
So there's two things there. My preference as a non-exec director was that the board should be more representative of the community that the Post Office serves. So it currently has 2 female board members, of which I am one. So as a NED of the Post Office, yes, I thought we should have a more diverse board. But the second part of that, of having a non-executive director, in this case the SID, who had public sector experience, was a view from the shareholder, which I shared, rather than just my personal view.
And which you communicated to the board?
Yes, and to Mr. Staunton.
So my question was then, was your concern about the approach that Mr. Staunton had taken to the appointment of Mr. Darfur, one purely of form, that is to say, the procedure that was adopted, or one of substance?
It was about the procedure. I think that there could have been a sort of open discussion about the substance of it. As it was, there wasn't.
You say in your statement that you considered that the chair's behaviour had, by late December and early January, become increasingly erratic and concerning to you?
I think what I say in my statement is that it was described like that by members of the executive team, I think.
I think we can have a look, but I think you say that was a concern that was shared.
Yes, sorry, yes, it wasn't just my view, I think is the...
Yeah, it was a concern that was shared by by your colleagues on the board as well, is that correct? That the existing senior independent director and Miss Burton?
Yes, it was, yeah.
Those concerns culminated in a meeting between Mr. Tiswell, the SID, and Mr. Creswell, is that correct?
It was a phone call, but yeah.
Forgive me,
Yeah.
a discussion
Yes, yeah.
about his concerns, and in a submission jointly authored by you and Mr. Creswell to the Secretary of State, in which you recommended that she exercise her powers to dismiss the chair, is that right?
Yes, that he was removed from the board, yeah.
Beyond that short summary, is there anything further you wish to say on the topic of the chair's dismissal?
No, I think that is an accurate reflection of what happened.
Thank you. The final topic then, please, concerns the recent survey commissioned by the inquiry and undertaken by YouGov of current serving postmasters and the high levels of dissatisfaction expressed in that survey by the postmasters on a variety of issues, including the operation of Horizon and the recovery of shortfalls. The inquiry has heard evidence that this is a matter that has been discussed at board level, most recently on the 24th of September of this year, is that correct?
Actually, most recently Tuesday of this week, where there was an additional board, but yes, it was also discussed in September.
Can you give us an indication in relation to the most recent discussion, what the board's doing about this issue, what action's been taken to address it, please?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I've touched on some of it in previous things I've said. So with relation particularly to the discrepancies point and postmasters continuing to experience discrepancies, the post office exec are in the process of appointing an independent review, a third-party review of Horizon and its robustness. They're in discussions with Voice of the Postmaster and NSFP about the terms of reference for that and how those groups are going to be involved in the process. So it's not going to be a sort of sign off the terms of reference, get the product at the end. It's going to be involvement throughout with a view to providing, they're then planning on publishing it, so making it sort of fully available to whoever wants to see it. They're also planning as part of that and inviting postmasters, and I think they might have already done it, into the Chesterfield Operations Centre, which is run by Mel Park, who's also given evidence. So they can be completely transparent on what the various stages of operational process management is for where there are discrepancies, so that they are transparent on that. They also plan on publishing quite a lot more evidence, information about Horizon. They've got a lot of it in terms of uptime and bugs and whatever. They plan on making more of that available as well. The board is very supportive of that. I also mentioned earlier the plan to get postmasters more involved in the various bits of the business. That is still more of a work in progress as to where it's actually going to sort of finally land, but it is a piece of work that is getting taken forward with a lot of vigour.
And is this particular issue, namely ongoing concerns by postmasters about the reliability of Horizon, one which you've escalated to the department as part of your risk reporting in relation to Post Office? Yes,
absolutely. They are concerned. I am concerned. The board generally and the executive team are concerned.
Thank you. I've no further questions.
Thank you.
Before we ask co-participants to ask their questions, can I just take that latter point a little further? Because what I mean by that is the query about the reliability of Horizon. You're probably aware, Ms. Gratton, that I've heard evidence in recent weeks about what might be thought to be a degree of conflict between Fujitsu and the Post Office in relation to the reliability of the current version of Horizon. And allied to that, to what extent, if at all, reliance should be placed upon it in recovering what appear to be, and I use the words appear to be very advisedly, as you'd guess, shortfalls, and or taking action against postmasters, either to recover shortfalls or to report them to the police. Where has the board got in relation to that? If I can have an update from you, as this time wearing your Post Office director hat, as opposed to what you might be telling the department.
So in terms of where the Post Office has got to with Fujitsu on the system reliability issue?
Well, all of those issues, if you can bring me up to date on them. Well, let's start with what I understand to be the position, and then you tell me if there's any alteration. That as of today, so to speak, or the last time I heard evidence, the Post Office was not seeking to recover apparent shortfalls from postmasters. Is that still the position?
That there is no civil recovery, and my understanding is that there is no passing of information to the police on the basis of shortfalls, so no. Right.
And so that answers the second part of the question relating to prosecutions. And so far as the reliability of Horizon as debated between Post Office and Fujitsu, we'll hear from Mr. Patterson on Monday. But from your perspective, is there simply an impasse in the sense that there was the exchange of letters in the summer and nothing further has happened? Or has something further happened?
I'm not sure if anything further has happened. I know that the chairman has met with Fujitsu with a view to discussing the extension of the Horizon contract post-March 25. My understanding is that there is some nuance in Fujitsu's position whereby they do not want the data to be used for criminal convictions, but they are not questioning the integrity of the data within the system, is my understanding from Post Office's IT people.
Right, so that we don't confuse what you might have been told perfectly in good faith with the formalities, so to speak. Has the Post Office board discussed this in the last few weeks?
Not in the last few weeks. It has been discussed at board meetings through oral updates from the as-was acting CEO over the summer, and that was the position that he outlined to the board.
Right, okay, fine. Thank you. Right, over to the co-participants.
Hello, I'm waiting for my microphone to come on. I can speak up first.
No, you're still very indistinct, Mr. Jacobs.
Okay, I'll wait until it's done.
Oh, that's better. Thank you very much.
I
should have known that I have to press a button, but sorry about that. Ms. Gratton, I'll start again. I represent a large number of sub-postmasters and assistants who were affected by the Horizon scandal. And I want to ask you about the hard powers of ministerial intervention that you detail in your statement. So can we just turn to paragraph 27 of your statement, and that's WIT N113 10100, and it's page 12 of 103. So looking at that whole paragraph, you say there are several ways in which the Secretary of State and ministers at DBT can and do intervene in Post Office's governance and management. And most directly, the Secretary of State has the power under the Articles of Association to dismiss the chair of the Post Office Board and the Post Office directors, including executive directors, and then you cite the relevant part of the Articles of Association. Now, that is what I think witnesses have called the nuclear option. That was in place during the course of the events that the inquiry is considering. Is that right?
I actually don't know the answer to that.
No, you weren't there at the time, of course. Take it from me then, there's been evidence to say that that was right. So moving on to what you also say, if we could look at the 7th or 8th line down where it says the revised Articles of Association also allow the Secretary of State to give directions to Poll. Can you see that there?
Yeah.
Which requires Poll to take all steps within its power to do what those directions require to be done. and that is Article 7F of the revised Articles of Association. Now, I'm going to ask you a question that you may or may not be able to answer, because I know that you have been with UKGI since 2021, but were involved with the Post Office since, I think, May 2022?
So I've been involved with the Post Office probably since February 23.
23, sorry.
When my predecessor, it was announced my predecessor was stepping down, so I had a handover period.
Yes, and the revised articles were amended on the 14th of December 2022, so a few months before you came to Post Office. But did you know when you joined, were you told what the provenance of these articles is? Was this inserted as a result of the scandals, as a result of the Fraser judgments or the decision of the Court of Appeal in Hamilton and others?
I'm afraid I don't know.
You don't know. Okay, well, I'll move on. You say in your statement that, to your knowledge, this power to give directions hasn't been exercised. And we can take that down now from the screen. Thank you. Do you know under what circumstances the power would be exercised or could be exercised?
On one level, that is a decision for ministers, and they could choose to exercise it when they wish. They are the shareholder. In practice, I think they probably take the view that directing organisations and people to do things isn't conducive to a productive working relationship. So I would imagine in practice they would, as you have sort of called it, see that as a nuclear option. And if you are in a position as a Secretary of State where you find yourself directing a board, you may want to consider whether or not you have the right people on that board.
What I really wanted to ask you is, there's a difference, it appears, between the nuclear option, which is sacking and dismissing the board and reappointing another board and intervening directly and taking control, and the power to issue a direction to the board or to an individual to say, this is what Post Office has to do because the government is concerned that mistakes of the past are about to be repeated. Do you see that the second option is a more practical way of getting a result quickly, rather than a nuclear way of dismissing everybody?
Yes, I can see why you might think that. In practice, my instinct would be that if you're on a board where you find yourself being directed, you may think that you're not aligned with the shareholder.
Do you think, in light of the issues that this inquiry is looking at, and the scandal and the terrible effect that it has had on the lives of so many people, that that this direction is a useful way by which the shareholder can short-circuit matters if it thinks that history is about to repeat itself?
It could be, yes.
You, at about 10:25 this morning, you were asked about reporting operational matters up to the DBT, and you said that there are some things that the department is very concerned about, and you spoke about financial performance and budgets, and you gave an example of the YouGov survey. Is that the sort of thing that could be the subject of a direction if not properly resolved?
So I think in theory, yes, but I sort of come back to the idea that the board is appointed by the shareholder. As the shareholder, you would aspire to appoint people who have a shared understanding of the organisation's objectives as the shareholder, a shared understanding with the shareholder of the organisation's objectives. So I would hope that we wouldn't find ourselves there, because there is a sufficient dialogue and sort of common understanding between the shareholder and the board.
So I think what you're saying is that the direction would be given reluctantly and as a matter of last resort.
Yes, I think that is how the power is intended to be used.
Is there any guidance around the use of this power to give a direction, or is it entirely a matter of discretion?
I have not seen any guidance. It is the sort of thing that, were a Secretary of State minded to do so, they would expect to receive advice on prior to doing so from their officials.
Do you think there should be guidance so that the position can be clear as to the use of this power?
Potentially, although I would imagine that the specifics of a situation would be quite relevant to whether or not it was used.
You've been referred today in your evidence to some concerns that Mr. Jacobs and Mr. Ismail raised about retention of employees whose actions have been subject to criticism. That is a point of concern for many of our clients, if not all of them. And another point of concern, which you've also been referred to, is the YouGov survey, where 92% of the 1,000 sub-postmasters who responded said that they'd experienced issues with Horizon in the last 12 months, and 98% of those who reported shortfalls said that the most common resolution was to use branch money or resolve it themselves. These are serious matters, aren't they?
I absolutely agree, yes.
And do you think that if they continued, escalated, weren't resolved, that the direction could be used to prompt Post Office in the right direction?
So I wouldn't want to speculate, because I think that they are both matters that the board is taking very seriously.
Does it come to this, Ms. Gratton, that if it ever got to the point where the minister thought it appropriate to tell the board what to do, the reality is that he would have lost faith in the board, and or the board would have thought he was wrong, so they'd resign en masse?
Yes, I completely share your view.
Thank you, that's helpful. And finally from me, I want to refer you to what you say at paragraph 23 of your statement. There's no need to turn it up, I can read it out. The MOU contains provision for the shareholder team to make submissions directly to the DBT Permanent Secretary, Minister or Secretary of State. And you go on to say at paragraph 40, ultimately, should my team or I become aware of an issue that we do not consider the department has been fully cited on or has not fully considered, it may be appropriate to provide a submission directly to the departmental minister or permanent secretary. Have you or anyone in your team made any such submission?
So my team and I write a lot of advice that goes to ministers. In practice, all of the instances of that I have experienced, seen in this since being in this role, have been done effectively jointly with the department. So that advice has gone through Carl Cresswell and David Bickerton. Where there is a difference of views between somebody in the department and someone in UKGI, that has been noted in the submission, but I have never found myself in a position where I've had such a violent disagreement with the department that I have felt the need to put up advice aside from their process.
And do you consider that it is part of your function in making such submissions to request for a direction if you think that is necessary or appropriate?
I think in theory it could be, but again, it's not a situation in which I have found myself. Also, with the specific relation to my role, I am not there to direct the board, right? So when I am in a board meeting, I am a non-executive director. I am not a decision maker on behalf of the shareholder. So I am reflecting the shareholder's view, and then the board is taking a decision, and then if the shareholder approval is required, the decision of the board goes to the shareholder for approval.
But you do feedback concerns, don't you?
Yes.
Thank you. I don't have any further questions for you. Thank you.
Mr. Jacobs.
Good morning, Ms. Gratton. You'll be glad to hear we've only got two topics we'd like to cover, and both of them relate to your witness statement. The first relates to your general reflections at the end of your statement on the efforts made to engage with sub-postmasters who might be eligible for compensation. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to ask for it to come on screen, but if you want to have it in front of you, it's page 93. And you deal in the statement with the approach being taken to new putative applicants to the HSS, the letters being sent, and how they highlight the fixed offer available. And I'm not going to read directly, but I just want to highlight a couple of paragraphs. If you look at 202 in front of you, you start by looking at the overturned compensation scheme, and you set how initially there were 3 letters being sent highlighting the right to appeal, the right to compensation, criminal cases review, and so on. And then you say the work's largely been superseded by the implementation of the exoneration policy. And you finalise it by saying the Post Office has also been in contact with Citizens Advice to provide support and information for potential applicants, and has encouraged the few applicants who do not have legal representatives to seek legal advice to expedite their claims. Now, that's the overturned conviction scheme. You go on to the HSS and say, on the HSS, much of the work to identify potential claimants had been done before my appointment as at NED, including writing to former and current postmasters who met the eligibility criteria and publishing information on the website. You refer to the huge increases we've heard about following the drama, and you say that the Post Office is planning to write again to potential applicants, setting out details of the 75,000 offer, the appeals process and the end date. And then you go on to say you've been asked about how the communication with applicants is going. You say you're aware that there have been concerns about the offer letters and that previously a complaint had been made to the SRA. You say that the wording in the letter has changed and you're not aware of major issues arising around Post Office's communications with claimants. And I won't read out all of that because you say you're not in the thick of it, as it were, around how the timings and so on of compensation is dealt with. But since you've raised the letters, can you help the inquiry with whether or not access to legal advice is addressed expressly in the current letters being sent to HSS applicants?
I'm afraid I don't know.
You don't know. We've heard a lot today about differences in approach to legal advice. Do you know at high level whether would-be applicants to the HSS are encouraged to seek legal advice in the same way that individuals in the overturned compensation scheme would be?
So I actually don't know whether this came up with Mr. Creswell yesterday, but legal fees in legal advice is reimbursed, the cost of which is reimbursed in HSS only upon receipt of the offer, not prior to the offer being made. So not at the point of application. That is a decision for the department that the department has taken.
And indeed, we did cover that. The inquiry's heard that, and that's why I've raised it. What I wanted to ask you was, has that issue of legal advice and funding for legal advice, I apologise, I'm being reminded that I may have said overturned compensation scheme. Of course, we're talking about the difference with the overturned conviction scheme. I misspoke. But returning to the question, has that issue about legal advice and encouraging legal advice, or the question of funding legal advice earlier in the process for HSS applicants, been discussed at the remediation committee?
Yes, it has extensively.
And are you able to help the inquiry on what has been said?
So the remediation committee, of which I am part, thinks that claimants should be offered legal advice at the point of application. I think it's quite hard to decide whether or not you should take a fixed sum offer without having some support in that process. That view from the committee has been made clear to the department. The department has taken a different view.
Thank you. Now, moving to the second topic. I want to deal briefly with transparency, which is a topic that's been addressed a lot this morning in the questions by Ms Hodge. And I think are you aware that about the announcement in the King's speech this year that the government intends to bring in a law with a duty of candour for all public servants and those acting with public functions, colloquially known to most people as the Hillsborough Law, recognising the campaign by those families involved in the Hillsborough scandal and the recommendations of Bishop Jones? Is that something you're aware of?
Yes, it was disclosed to me as part of the bundle.
Yeah. And we know in the speech, his speech to his party conference on 24th of September, just about 6 weeks ago, the Prime Minister said a bit more about that law. And he said, and I hope you don't mind, I'm going to quote what was said, because we don't know very much about government thinking. He said, "For many people in this city, the speech they may remember was the one here 2 years ago, because that's when I promised on this stage that if I ever had the privilege to serve our country as Prime Minister, one of my first acts was to bring in a Hillsborough law, a duty of candour, a law for Liverpool, a law for the 97, a law that people should never have needed to fight so hard to get, but that will be delivered by this government. It's also a law for the sub-postmasters in the Horizon scandal. He goes on, the victims of infected blood, Windrush, Grenfell Tower, and the countless injustices over the years suffered by working people at the hands of those that were supposed to serve them. Truth and justice concealed behind the closed ranks of the state. And he goes on to say a little bit more about what it will do. This is the meaning of Clause 1, because today I can confirm that the duty of candour will apply to public authorities and public servants. The bill will include criminal sanctions, and that the Hillsborough law will be introduced to Parliament before the next anniversary in April. It's work that shows how a government of service must act in everything it does. And he ends, you got a couple of paragraphs later on. It doesn't mean that everyone will agree, but it does mean we understand that every decision we take together. Now, I just want to ask you, because of your role and your connection with the Post Office as a director on the board and your role as with UKGI, have you been involved so far in any conversation within government as to how this new duty of candour might apply to arm's-length bodies or public corporations?
No, I haven't.
Thank you.
Is that it, Ms. Hodge?
So there's some, I think, a few questions from Ms. Watt.
Right.
Good afternoon, Ms. Gratton. Yes, I'm over here. I think I just have to get Mr. Jacobs to move. Thank you. Thank you very much. I ask questions on behalf of the NFSP. I have a couple of topics to follow up on from your evidence this morning as given to Council to the inquiry. Earlier in answering questions from Council to the inquiry about the reference in your witness statement regarding the postmaster NEDs on occasions failing to distinguish between their roles as Post Office board members and postmasters themselves. So you remember that part. You gave an example of how difficult the postmaster NEDs, had found it when the board was dealing with its financial positions, such as the budget discussions, and you said those discussions were tricky because the company is not able to pay postmasters the remuneration they would like to because simply there aren't the funds for it. And you said they found that position difficult to accept. So I wanted to put it to you that from your perspective, it's great to hear from those postmaster NEDs on the board, but the truth is actually they of themselves, as postmaster NEDs, can't change the remuneration to postmasters. They can't increase it simply by virtue of being on the Post Office board. That's the case, isn't it?
Well, I don't think any board director is able to sort of magically generate funds for the Post Office to have. So to the extent that that is true of all of us, it is also true of the Postmaster non-executive directors. However, I don't think that is to say at all that they are not a vital part of the company, because I think they are, and I think their contribution, anyone who, we all bring our own kind of lived experiences to the board. I bring a perspective from the shareholder, they bring a perspective from postmasters. It's very difficult for the board to adequately understand that without their presence on the board. So I think they are integral to the board.
So good to hear from them, as I said.
I think they have as much say over the company as any other board director does.
If we think about the readout that you were taken to, the Bayes document, I'm not going to go back to it, you were already taken to it, and the comment of the Post Office CEO, Mr Reid, making the comment about the Postmaster NED role as to whether they're directors or trade union reps. It kind of goes back to what I've just asked you about, and he said he didn't know where that was going to go. That's the nub of the issue, really, isn't it? UKGI, Government Post Office, they have the Postmaster NEDs. That's an illustration of opening up and apparently engaging with postmasters. But the fact is, because of their two roles, the Postmaster NEDs are inevitably constrained, at least some of the time.
Postmaster NEDs are definitionally not independent non-executive directors. I am not an independent non-executive director. That means that in some situations they will find themselves conflicted in decision making. The number of situations in which that is true is very limited. I happen to think, I think we have a difference of opinion of this, I happen to think postmasters are a vital part of the Post Office board, and it's not appropriate to put them on a sort of separate board over there where the decision making isn't. I think they should be integral to the decision making in Post Office, which they are in virtue of being one of the 10 people around the board table, or 2 of the 10 people around the board table.
Well, it's really about if they're listened to, isn't it? Because the YouGov poll commissioned by the inquiry, EXPG, I think it's 6 zeros at page 39. I'm not going to it. But it says that 60% of the postmaster respondents think that the Post Office Board doesn't listen to the postmaster NEDs. And on the evidence of the postmaster NEDs themselves, they think they're not listened to. So really, your view and the view of postmasters and those NEDs are actually quite different, aren't they?
So I think there has been a particular issue around the amount that the postmaster non-executive directors have been able to discuss the work that they do on Post Office's board with their postmaster colleagues. I understand that they had some advice from the Post Office legal team that they weren't allowed to discuss what went on in board meetings. That is going to change going forward. Post Office board meetings minutes are going to be published. I think there will be more latitude going forwards for postmaster non-exec directors to discuss what happens in board meetings. And I think that will show the influence that they have on the organisation. But being a non-executive director is different to being an executive of the company. They do not run the Post Office. They are there as a board member to provide accountability for the CEO. It is the chief executive's job to run the Post Office.
Whatever the rights and wrongs of all of that, there are many tools of engagement with postmasters, including engagement with representative bodies such as the NFSP, which has 6,500 postmaster members. I mean, it's not the be-all and end-all, not one thing. You mentioned something over to the side. There's actually lots of ways in which Post Office and the board can engage with postmasters, as well as having the 2 postmaster NEDs.
I couldn't agree more with you, and I think there should be engagement with postmasters at all levels of the business. As I mentioned earlier, at a commercial level, treating people as genuine franchise partners, at an oversight in terms of how postmasters are treated with relation to issues that have been concerned in the past, and at a decision-making level at the board. I think it should be throughout the organisation. Yes.
Just one more topic. I think it's fair to say, you can correct me if I'm wrong, that you and UKGI, so when I say you, not you personally, as you've often said, in your role as the shareholder NED representing UKGI, consider that the role of the shareholder NED is the one that actually helps to give the oversight of the Post Office Board. Is that how you see that role, as well as being on the board? The role of the UKGI shareholder, that the NED has some oversight of what's happening?
I don't think that's a term that I've used, no. I think that I am there as one of 10-ish board members. As a non-executive, I am there to help the company understand the views of the shareholder and to provide the shareholder with insight from the company. I don't think I have a particular oversight role as distinct from any other board member.
Thank you. In your earlier answer to Council to the Inquiry, you effectively dismissed the need for an oversight committee of the type proposed by the NFSP. I just want to ask you some things about that. That proposal arises out of the failures in culture that led to the Horizon scandal. Also the government, culture and governance not having changed sufficiently since Lord Justice Fraser's judgment. And now we have the Grant Thornton report, which shows an almost total failure to get to grips with the issues he outlined. So the Oversight Committee is not proposed by the NFSP as the be-all and end-all, and postmaster engagement would continue with them, but as something there as to help the restoration of public trust, actual oversight of the board, which has in fact failed to change itself, and the Post Office. That's what oversight is for, and with a range of representative bodies, consumer champions, specialist members as needed, and Post Office and government representation, that could never actually be a bad thing, could it?
I think we just have a difference of opinion on this matter. I think that if the current structures aren't working, you should fix the current structures. I don't necessarily think more is better in terms of boards and committees.
Thank you.
So I think that concludes the evidence of Ms Gratton.
Well, I'm very grateful to you, Ms Gratton, for making a long and detailed witness statement and for answering everyone's questions here this morning and into this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So we'll adjourn for lunch, I take it, Ms Hodge?
So yes, should we resume at 2 o'clock?
Yeah, by all means, fine.